I'm now going to look at the HDR performance of the monitor, and I'm on the desktop just for now so I can show you how the local dimming solution of this monitor works. It is VESA DisplayHDR 600 certified, this one, and that does require some degree of local dimming, which this monitor does offer, but it's very basic. It only has 8 dimming zones, and they're arranged as vertical bands running down the screen. So the whole of that vertical band dims or brightens at the same time, as you can see with this nice little demonstration here, and there's a link to this in the description of the video, this specific local dimming test if you want to see it for yourself. It's fairly reactive. I'm using the high local dimming setting. You can adjust this, but I would recommend high. It's actually a bit more gradual for larger bright objects such as this blob here. You might be able to see there's more of a trail, more of a gradual fade out when it moves, even when it's moved right across the screen. I know it can be a little bit tricky to see, but you get the idea. Basic local dimming solution just gives you a situational edge in contrast, and it doesn't completely shut off the zones which are not in use, and that's even when it's trying to display pure black as it is here. Most content that which you display in games is going to be mixed. It's going to have lots of different shade brightnesses, so you're not going to get amazing depth or anything like that, but it just gives you an edge compared to with the local dimming solution disabled, and I will just show you that quickly for comparison. So it's in picture, HDR, local dimming, or HDR game, HDR movie. 3 HDR settings on this monitor. They're exactly the same, but there are just some different settings which you can apply differently in each preset if you want. So you've got 3 different presets you can use for different applications, whatever you might want to do. These are all explored in the OSD video and the test settings video, by the way, if you're curious, because I'm not going to go through them here. But this is with local dimming off, so you can see that it just stays at a high brightness throughout the screen, makes the IPS glow a lot more noticeable, and for the dark regions, the massive uplift in terms of the shade depth, so it's not as dark as it should be. And I've just set the local dimming to low. So again, it's quite reactive, but this is, you can't really see the differences between the different local dimming settings so well in this particular test. But basically, it will be more reluctant to dim down as much. That's the main difference I notice. It sometimes doesn't brighten up as much either. So the zones aren't really quite as reactive as what I'm trying to say. And it's explored more in the written review, but if you prefer a gentler approach to the dimming, you're finding the high setting too much, then consider medium or low. And actually this larger blob here is probably a better demonstration because the depth is still quite high there. I'm just going to pause the video and show you the different settings. So that's low. That's middle. Don't know if you can see in the video, but it has improved the depth. And that's high, which has very slightly improved the depth. Actually, medium or middle and high are reasonably similar. I think low is really more distinct from those two. Back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I'm running the game under HDR now. And I'm using an RTX 3090 connected via DisplayPort. I did test with HDMI 2.1 and it was a similar experience. You may have noticed in the section video I showed you before with the local dimming test, there were some other settings associated with HDR, but I've got that all at default. And if you're interested in these settings, I explore them in the best settings video or the OSD video as well, which the best settings video is just really part of. And they do let you tweak the image if you like to do that under HDR, but I prefer how things look by default, so that's what I'm going to stick to. And I'm really more interested in the overall capabilities of the monitor on the hardware side, which is not dictated by some little settings you'll adjust. So this monitor is VESA DisplayHDR 600 certified, which I may have mentioned earlier. So that's a reasonable level of HDR you can expect just based on the certification, but of course that doesn't really tell you an awful lot about the performance, except for the fact that it does have local dimming, which I've shown you, and that it should reach around 600 nits of peak luminance or slightly exceed that. But if you're interested in some further readings, then check out the written review. So the daylight there, it's quite bright. The monitor's not trying to pump out its maximum luminance because this is sort of passive illumination. The game is not going for maximum brightness there, but it's still a bit more subdued than I might expect. Because if you consider the vertical dimming zones, you've got a darker area there, darker and medium shades, the brighter shades higher up, and it can't just brighten that dimming zone up to the maximum. If it did, then it would really affect the depth of the dark shade. So it sort of compromises and it reaches a middle ground really, where the darker shades are actually less deep than they should be, so there's less atmosphere, it's a term I like to use, and the brightness isn't as bright as it could be, but it just compromise. And further over, where it's showing just darker and medium shades, the depth is better, but even then, it really is an intricate mixture of medium and dark shades, Ideally you'd have better precision for the illumination, and that would give really nice depth to the dark areas and just help the medium shades stand out a bit more and actually add a bit of depth to some of these medium dark shades as well. So yes, very limited dimming precision with only 8 zones, several million pixels on this monitor, so 8 zones is a tiny number. It just does give that situational edge and contrast. And just to demonstrate this, I'm going to turn the local dimming solution off. So now things look completely flooded. You can instantly see that IPS glow brought out, and I can see that very clearly to my eye. There's just an obvious haziness. There's a lack of depth to the darker shades. The bright shades are slightly brighter now actually, but the contrast isn't there. The whole screen is brighter. It's just universally illuminated to a bright level, regardless of the shades being displayed, and the whole screen doing it at once, with the backlight controlled as a single unit. So back to my preferred high local dimming setting, certainly does make a positive difference, even with just 8 dimming zones. Under HDR you also get 10-bit colour processing, and that allows for an enhanced variety of shades. It allows the monitor to put its gamut to good use as well, and I'll come on to that a little bit later on. But it gives a greater variety of subtle shade distinctions. Basically it helps give a little bit of an uplift, a natural looking uplift to darker areas, unlike a gamma enhancement under SDR, which just starts giving a flooded look. But to really accentuate this, you would have better dimming precision than is offered here. And it's the same with the brighter shades. The 10-bit colour reproduction helps there. It gives you smoother gradients, more natural progressions of shades. So for the mist over the water here and the light rays, that kind of thing. Some pretty smooth gradients, but again, the dimming precision isn't there to really have very bright shades, somewhat dimmer shades, etc., all displayed together. So it's only part of the equation which this monitor gets right. And yes, it doesn't look like a giant ball of light, it's a bit more like that to the eye, but again, you can't appreciate how things would really look on this monitor unless you see it in person. Now if I look at this scene, and I consider the brightness of the glint on the water surface, for example, again, that isn't supposed to be the maximum brightness of the monitor because that's not what the game is going for, but even so, it should be brighter than is shown here. I measured 245 nits, so really it's not anywhere near as bright as it should be. With local dimming off, it does brighten up significantly. It's now 460 nits I measured. So again, not quite the maximum of the monitor, but it shouldn't be quite at the maximum of the monitor. That's not what the game is going for. But if you look at the rest of the image, I'm not sure if this will be clear on the video, but clear to my eye that there's a distinct lack of depth, even over there where there are lots of dark and medium shades. It's just uplifted, has a foggy look. It's not nice at all. And then with local dimming set to high, it does improve that. It's not incredible because again, you've got very limited dimming precision, and yes, the little shadowy details around the vegetation and the rock cracks should be deeper than they are, and there should be more depth to a lot of these medium shades than there is, but even so, there is some situational improvement. I also talked a little bit about the reactivity of the dimming zones in the section of the video earlier when I was showing the local dimming test. I would say that in general, I don't find the local dimming solution distracting on most scenes. I'm not really too aware of it doing its thing, but it does depend on the scene. There are certainly some scenes where it can be more noticeable. There's a lot of dark content and smaller bright shades moving across the screen, for example, and certainly you can be aware of the illumination and the dimming of the zones. I'd just like to show you this scene again because it's the one I showed you when I was talking about contrast. You can see that, there's IPS glow, there's a mixture of shades here, lots of different shade depths, and the dimming precision really is just too limited to deliver the kind of look that's expected in this scene. Having said that, it does still help, so I'm just going to sort of let the camera and everything stabilize, and then I'm going to turn the local dimming solution off just so you can see what it would look like without it. It just looks extremely flooded now, more so than it did before. The brightness in the middle there, it is brighter because it's not trying to dim down at all. The torch there does stand out more, or at least it's brighter, but the contrast really isn't there. There's just a foggy look. Local dimming back to high doesn't perform miracles by any means. This scene does not look as it can under HDR at all, but it's still an improvement. I'm now on Battlefield 5 running the game under HDR just so I can show you this scene. This is a scene which does have a mixture of shades, but there's quite a lot of bright dominance with the shades. And this is a scene which OLED monitors will struggle with because they have an ABL automatic brightness limiter that kicks in when there's this much bright shade on the screen at once. This monitor doesn't have an automatic brightness limiter behavior or anything like that. And the sun here, it is nice and bright, nice and eye-catching. the game is going for that. It really does want to pump out really strong luminance. And it's not extreme in this case. It's not 1000 nits plus, as some monitors can provide here. However, I recorded 557 nits, so that's actually quite close to the maximum which I recorded on this monitor. So it definitely stands out nicely. What I would say though is, again, because it doesn't have extreme luminance and it doesn't have extreme luminance precision, you don't get this same look that you should get with the glint of light down here, for example. It isn't as well defined as it should be. There should be a nice array of brighter shades and medium shades, and that's kind of lost a bit here. I'm on another scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, again running HDR, and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction now, another important aspect of HDR. So under HDR, the developers can target DCI-P3 or Rec 2020, a massive gamut, and as you can see on the screen here, just as a reminder, you get 91% DCI-P3 coverage on this monitor. So it's not an amazing gamut for HDR content, but it's reasonable. And I would say the monitor puts it to pretty good use as well. So things don't look super vibrant, but they look reasonably rich, and there's a nice array of greens without the kind of yellowish green push that I observed under SDR. Perhaps some of the shades do look a little bit more muted than they could, but I think that is actually partly down to the lack of dimming precision as well. As I was talking about before, that does just naturally add extra depth if you have improved dimming precision. It's all linked together under HDR, the tone mapping and the luminance levels, the relative shade depths. And those blue flowers there certainly aren't as eye-catching as I've seen on some models, but they still have a nice pop to them and they stand out quite well even if I'm not specifically looking for them. So a decent amount of vibrancy, and they don't look kind of white like they do on the screen, and that's because the brightness is just a little bit too high. Looks a bit more like that, but unfortunately you can't see on the video what it will look like to the eye. And if I look at Lara's skin, as I mentioned with the green shades, they're a bit overdone under SDR. Lara's skin is as well, and it looked a little bit too tanned, whereas under HDR it's toned down because they're not targeting sRGB. There's not the oversaturation now, that's not an issue. The fire as well, that is toned down, although this particular fire is not a very good example because it's quite a whitish yellow with sort of pale orange even under SDR, but just in general the fires on this game and other games, they're a bit overdone under SDR and they're toned down under HDR, but there are still some really nice licks of vibrancy. So I'd say that overall, when you look at the whole package under HDR, it certainly isn't as impressive as some models under HDR, and I would not buy this monitor for its HDR performance, but it does still offer some benefits in terms of the somewhat higher luminance than some models will provide. Decent colour gamut because some HDR capable monitors will barely cover sRGB, so this one certainly does better than that. And it can just give you a bit of variety using HDR every now and then, and on this monitor I think it's something which you might want to explore using now and then.